And he introduces a tripartite expression between sense, designated, and expressors. Being is said in a single sense, but that of which it is said differs. The expressors of this sense differ in each instance. If psychic individuation is the affirmation of recurrence, and if this is the locus for the access to the realm of pre-individual singularities and impersonal individuations, which it clearly is in Deleuze's account of difference of eternal recurrence, then Deleuze becomes involved in a bizarre parody of Hegelianism, where consciousness, psychic individuation, marks the region wherein time or being is folded back in on itself. So, the problem is, as I see it, is that what Deleuze ends up doing is transcendental access is ontologically internalized in a philosophy of purely actual rather than possible experience. And this seems to be the meaning of Deleuze's transcendental empiricism. But if transcendental access is ontologically internalized in Deleuze's account of psychic individuation, then the account of this internalization happens through an account of the genesis of actual rather than merely possible experience. And indeed, Deleuze explicitly identifies this moment of access with a moment of transcendence. It is the transcendent use of the faculties provoked by the encounter with individuating intensity, as the unthinkable proper to thought or the imperceptible proper to perception, which gives birth to thinking in thought. The heart of the crucial chapter in the Image of Thought chapter, which is the core of the book, because it mirrors the two halves of the book into one another, the transcendental aesthetic and the transcendental dialectic. Deleuze it's a theory, it's a transcendental theory for the genesis of thought. But it occurs in the middle of the week. In other words, he doesn't begin with an account of how thinking accesses the world. He shows how, on the basis of occurrences of thinking in the world, which is the psychic contractions affected by these larval selves, there's a concatenation. There are these nested series of individuations which eventually give rise to a genesis of thinking, of what we call thinking, philosophical thinking, ontological thinking, within the bounds, within reality, within the world. So thinking like feeling for Deleuze is always the result of a gratuitous provocation. But here we are confronted with the most puzzling, or not to say problematic, aspect of Deleuze's project, Indifference and Repetition. For this double genesis of thinking and being, which is articulated in his theory of the disjunctive use of the faculties. The double genesis of thinking and being in the encounter with the cogitandum, or I'll use that as a cipher for all the other transcendental objects that are proper to the faculties. The unthinkable that provokes thought, the immemorial that provokes memory, the imperceptible that provokes perception. These transcendental provocations unfold divergent lines of actualization in the real according to arbitrarily conventional distinctions between the form and function of faculties on one hand and regions or senses of being on the other. For what has Deleuze's unyoking of difference from the fourfold shackles of representation achieved if these diverging channels of actualization for ontological differentiation remain tethered to what Kant would have called a merely rhapsodic catalogue of facultative distinction on one hand and an equally rhapsodic enumeration of the different senses of being on the other? Kant famously criticizes Aristotle and his scholastic predecessors, who saying that they haven't deduced the list of categories properly. They've merely enumerated them using, pre-existing conventions. The point is to show how these, if being is going to be categorially differentiated, then the point is to show that these differentiations are necessary a priori. They're not merely arbitrarily generated on the basis of empirical distinctions. But if being is said in a single sense of everything that is, but everything that is differs, what is the status of this modal difference in everything that is, i.e. the difference between the kinds of faculties, the difference between thinking and feeling and memory and perception? Deleuze seems to want to use Bergson to synthesize Spinoza and Kant. Famously, Spinoza cannot deduce the number and nature of the attributes or categories, while Kant deduces the categories, but only by yoking them to representation. But the Bergsonian method of intuition seems to offer a way of identifying the real nature of differentiation by characterizing differences in nature in terms of these divergent tendencies of actualization. And it's crucial in Bergson, there are real differences between the psychic and the material, between space and time, between culture and nature, and different kinds of nature. And the problem with Bergson's method of intuition is that it seems to be a very flimsy basis for enumerating, for identifying the real distinctions in being. Thus, for Deleuze, the key to grasping ontological differentiation, the real differences in being, lies in seizing the differences in actualization. But here, despite his own critique of the Bergsonian dualism of concept and intuition, or difference of degree and difference in kind, he is forced once more to rely on what is merely given, or merely given differences between nature, culture, psyche, etc. And I think that this key kind of this moment of equivocation, or this fragility in Deleuze's in Deleuze's execution of the transcendental project, is actually the result of the decisive role of psychic individuation. Because if individuation provides a sufficient reason for actualization, and actualization, these divergent lines of actualization, tells us what kind of differences there are in the world, and if it is psychic individuation that is the ultimate determinant for actualization, then, in spite of all these precautions, in spite of the fact that Deleuze seems to, for all of Deleuze's critique of good sense and common sense and representation, he is once more merely relying on a kind of empirical instances, empirical discriminations to identify these ontological differences, these divergent actualizations.